Richard Rorty is, I would urge, one of the most profound and influential philosophers in the current high cultural scene, which is to say in the last 25 years, he certainly established himself as one of the most eminent, not only philosophers, but cultural critics. He's dabbled in literary criticism, political theory, and had a very rich connection with various thinkers, running from Derrida to Habermas, and of course the great American literary critic Harold Bloom. In his philosophy, he's drawn on and, I'd urge, extended the insights and work of Willard Van Orman Quine, as well as figures like Wilfrid Sellars and Donald Davidson. What he's tried to do is move post-analytic American philosophy, which is the philosophy that comes out of the Quinean destruction of positivism, in a purely pragmatic direction, and has in fact attempted to argue that both the continental and American analytic traditions are both headed down the same road, and if they take the next 3 steps, will wind up with pragmatism and William James. Like James and Dewey before him, Rorty's pragmatism is deeply informed by a powerful commitment to democracy, as well as naturalism, tolerance, and a sort of intellectual openness. In addition to, and here I think is what becomes significant, a profound awareness of the contingency of all of those values themselves. None of them are taken as absolutes, or finals, or givens, but rather as particular forms of life that have emerged in America and in the West, and which we cherish on the basis of our experience of them, not on the basis of their foundations. As an historicist, which is to say a reader of Hegel, much of Rorty's work has taken the form of a critique of the modern, what we might call capital P philosophic tradition, a tradition which Rorty claims centers around capital T truth and capital R reality. So Rorty wants to get rid of all these capital letters and start bringing back little p philosophy, little t truth, and little r reality. I think the first major work that tried to argue this and create this sort of sense of transformation was a really path-breaking work called Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. In that text, Rorty suggests that the history of modern philosophy, particularly epistemology-based philosophy, from Descartes all the way up to the present day, is based on the notion that there is some sort of a medium, a third party that intervenes between ourselves and the world. This medium, in every case, it is represented as, in some sense, mirroring the world. And it is only with this medium, or third party, that we in fact have any sort of contact. And of course, you've heard this before. This is the notion of truth as correspondence, when that medium correctly copies in its representations the world that it is a copy of. So, very briefly, I want to run through the historical critique that Rorty offers. He begins with Descartes, because Descartes really begins the whole project for him. Descartes introduced, and I hope you'll remember Locke refined, the positive mind and its ideas as the medium between ourselves and the world. Right? So, in this sense, the mind is, as it were, as he says, a mirror, in which our various ideas are representations of the world. And what the philosopher does is he looks at that mirror, right? And he looks and tries to find out which representations have the markings of accuracy, of copying. And for Descartes, we'll remember those properties were clear and distinct. So he looked into his mind's eye, as it were, his mind mirroring the world, and said whichever representations are clear and distinct are true. Locke, on the other hand, said whichever representations can be seen to be derived from sense are true. That's how we know they're a correct copy. And of course, philosophy does more than that too. Through analysis, right, and reflexive contemplation, presumably the philosopher not only picks out the right representation, but sort of polishes the mirror up. So you can see a little more clearly in the future. He clarifies concepts, as it were, or so the locutions run. Now, there was a problem we found with positing that veil of ideas, right, that stands between us and the world, that show between our ears, as it were. The problem was skepticism. It's impossible to prove that, in fact, there is any world beyond just that veil of ideas, and that if it is there, that those ideas correspond or copy the world, which is the self-defined notion of truth. Which is to say, it's hard to tell whether our ideas correspond with the way the world, capital R, really is. Now, Kant tried to solve this problem with his Copernican revolution. Right? He introduced the notion of a conceptual scheme, that, in fact, a lot of our interpretation of the world is supplied by ourselves, our own minds. In so doing, Kant was able to make epistemology, as the study and range of all possible knowledge within our mind-imposed a priori conceptual scheme, the architectonic discipline, or what we might call first philosophy, which was the position that metaphysics had taken for Aristotle. Now, I think you've learned from Professor Segru that Hegel undermined this project, right? He showed us that all of those conceptual schemes are historically contingent. They change over time, and they change across space. There are presumably cultures that do not have the notion of cause and effect. There may be cultures which do not have the, or are fully richly developed notion of physical four-dimensional objects, and therefore conceptual schemes are themselves contingent. And that, of course, as we know, led to the profusion of speculative metaphysical systems, because we found that science itself is just one conceptual scheme, and we got the flights of imaginative fancy. And then the positivists responded. They had to nail that conceptual scheme down to something so that they could get back to first philosophy, to the serious foundational task of grounding our beliefs. And what they did was turned linguistic. They took the conceptual scheme out of the mind and put it into language. So, thus, modern linguistic analysis is again an epistemological first philosophy. Language and its meanings have replaced mind in its ideas. And in fact, they are the exact same medium, but in a different form. Right? And of course, language and its meanings now are the representations which stand between ourselves and the world. And linguistic expressions are therefore said to be true when they accurately represent, copy, mirror, picture, or correspond to reality. And various philosophers have introduced new words that are basically synonymous with the others so that they can somehow seem new and unique. We're getting somewhere with this project. It's not just spinning its wheels. Rorty doesn't even bother to try and refute it so much, because Quine has already refuted it. He wants to ask a more interesting question. Why bother? Why bother give foundations? What's the instinct back there? And what he argues is that what underlies such philosophical projects and what unites them to their Platonic forerunners and forebearers is the desire to constitute philosophy as a metacultural criticism. Right? It is literally the desire to have a God's eye view of things. So the philosopher, through studying the medium of representation, can see things as they really are in their essence, just the way God would see things, not the way we see things. Moreover, the philosopher is a figure, very much we saw this with Ayer, but also with Kant and the others, who wants to stand up in his ivory tower in the philosophy department, look around the university and say, oh, you know, the stuff they're saying in the English department, it's a lot of nonsense. I know. I'm a philosopher. What they're doing in the science department, that's just fine. That's good. Historians, be a bit more like the scientists. As if he had this sort of metacultural role to criticize everything around him because he knows the nature of truth. He knows the nature of reality. He's seen into the bottom of representation. So the goal of such a philosopher is to stand above all of the other high cultural disciplines and tell them what's meaningful and what isn't. What's legitimate, what is not. And this is very much like Plato's philosopher king, isn't it? Right? Plato's philosopher king is going to go around and tell the poets, you can say this, but that poem you have, it's not allowed. Go away. Right? So literally, the modern philosopher would judge all the moves of all of the players in the high culture and decide on the basis of his epistemological criteria which are legitimate and which are bogus. Right? He would then be, as it were, the commissar of high culture. In the modern epoch, what this means is that the architectonic cultural role that was held by religion in the medieval period, right? And that finally, after several generations, was replaced in the Enlightenment by the scientist, right? This was the architectonic, fully human discipline, is now, at least according to its own self-conception, since the Kantian epistemological turn, held by philosophy, right? But what was once the high priest of humanity being a priest, then became a scientist, is now the logical positivist or the philosopher who discusses the nature of truth. Rorty argues that what we have, therefore, is not really a secular culture at all, because secularism is not replacing religion with science, or science with philosophy, but doing away with architectonic disciplines in the first place. A truly secular culture will have no architectonic disciplines, but will instead allow free play between all the various disciplines and fields, between all the aspects of culture. There will not be a propensity to say, well, you know, literature, that just expresses feelings. Rather, you'll say, no, literature has its place, and it's wonderful, and we should read it. Philosophy has its, science has its own role, history has a role, and none of these trump the other. There is no one that gets to the bottom of things. They each have their functions, right? No one is the queen of all of the sciences. I want then to turn to another text called Consequences of Pragmatism. In Consequences of Pragmatism, Rorty argues that pragmatism is the ultimate enemy of philosophy with a capital P, in both its metaphysical and its positivistic/analytical phases. In fact, he's very clear about this because he says, you know, we pragmatists are the ultimate enemies of the metaphysicians. The positivists think they are, but we'll show that they too are metaphysical. We're the ultimate opponents. And his point is, and it's an extremely pragmatic move, philosophy has spent the last 2,000 years trying to come up with a theory of truth. Correspondence theory, coherence theory, any other theory. And he says it's not impossible that you could come up with such a theory, but it is a fact that you haven't come up with one that wasn't trivial. Everything you've had to say so far about the theory of truth has turned out to be either wrong, and demonstrably so, or if it wasn't wrong, completely trivial and cliched. Something you could have found from anyone on the street corner. That's not to say that in 100 years you won't come up with it. I can't prove that. But rather, you haven't yet. You've had 2,000 years. Isn't it time to just change the subject? Right? Might it not be the case that this is just not a very fruitful topic of conversation? Rorty thinks it is time to stop trying. We should leave capital T truth alone and move on. Rorty thinks of truth as nothing more than a property of sentences, like 2 + 2 = 4. Cruelty is bad. Galileo preceded Newton. Good lectures are better than bad lectures. Right? When you're hungry, food sustains you. He says, right, all of those sentences are true. There's no problem with that. There is no interesting theory about what those sentences have in common, besides the fact that we all believe it. Any more than there's an interesting theory about what the various acts we approve of have in common. Their goodness, their virtueness, their abstract essence of approvability. No, there isn't. There's just various things we approve of. Similarly with truth. They're just various sentences we hold. Truth's a property of sentences, nothing more to say. Leave it at that. In fact, like James, Rorty thinks truth is a purely primitive normative concept. It's a compliment you pay to a sentence that's working for you, right? So, in a sense, we're back with James. Truth is what's good in the way of belief. And good, too, is just a compliment. You see an action, you approve of it. By saying good, you don't point out some particular feature it has. You simply say, yeah, keep doing that. I like that. And when you say bad, you say, don't do that anymore. I don't like that. That's all there is to it. And we don't need any more than that either. So what Rorty's saying is, James was mistaken in only one thing, calling that a theory of truth. It's not a theory of truth. It's a completely trivial remark to say about truth that it's a compliment you pay to sentences that work. It's completely trivial. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you realize that you don't have a theory of truth. What we have to do instead is what he calls change the conversation. And he gives a wonderful example. He says in the 18th century, after Newton wrote, there was a profound dispute between the issue of primary and secondary causes. Right? Newton has shown all the secondary causes of motion, the laws of dynamics. But what were the primary causes? What were the divine causes? What were the purposes behind it that started those secondary causes in motion? And Rorty points something out. We never solved that problem of what the primary causes were or what the relationships, the secondary causes were. We never solved it. We did. At a certain point, we decided, that's not a very fruitful topic of conversation. Let's just drop it. Let's just talk about secondary causes from here on in. And he says it's the exact same thing with truth. It's not that we have an answer for it. It's not that we can prove it's a bad question. It's not getting us anywhere. We've tried for 2,000 years. That's enough. Let's just drop it and move on to another conversation. Right? We should never try to offer such a theory or prove that such a theory is impossible, but just change the subject of high cultural conversation. Nonetheless, Rorty does argue at least a few claims against that correspondence theory of truth. Because such theories always assume that language is that medium of representation that we can compare to some fixed, final reality. And thus the connection between language and the world is a mirroring relation. Right? We saw this with air, that language could not be part of the world because it must mirror the world, it must picture the world, it must copy the world. But Rorty with Quine and Davidson thinks that language is part of the world. And the connection between our linguistic usages and other phenomena is purely causal. Right? We're a particular species, and our sounds, our culture is a means of coping with our environment. It's a tool that in itself evolves as we evolve, like opposable thumbs. So, for example, Einsteinian physics, right, is preferable to Newton's, not because it accurately represents the world, or is a better copy of the world, or more accurately mirrors the nature of the world, but simply because it better helps us to cope with nature by allowing us to make more accurate predictions, more precise calculations, and a good deal more powerful control over physical processes. And if one thinks of all of culture as doing that, as enabling one to cope, then one will not have the desire to draw an invidious comparison between the scientist and the poet, between the physicist and the priest. They each help us cope with our environment in one way or another. There's no need for such invidious distinctions. You can't dispense with any of them. And obviously, this is true of the human sciences, of the arts, right? It is not the case that science is true and painting and literature are something else. No, that too is a way of helping us interact with our world, with our environment. And therefore, we should think of beliefs not as metaphysical entities that mirror, but simply as habits of action. They're encoded ways of talking about our dispositions to behavior. Right? So, rather than think of a set of beliefs as some thing, intentional meaning between my ears, think of it as an encoding of a particular set of behaviors that can be predicted if one believes true that sentence or that belief. Habits of action. Rorty also argues for something he calls anti-realism. Now, don't confuse this with what Nelson Goodman calls irrealism, the view that there are many worlds as there are as ways of world-making. What Rorty argues is, and I think quite sharply, is that the notion of a final and fixed reality, which we can compare to our conceptual scheme, has literally this much, which is to say 0 explanatory power. Right? There is no way to actually ever compare your conceptual scheme to a fixed and final world because you always experience the world under some particular paradigm or conceptual scheme. We saw this with both Kuhn and Quine. So the point is that world, which our theories must correspond to, is a world well lost. It's a world which has no explanatory function. It's simply a form of metaphysical bootstrapping, of giving ourselves a pat on the back, oh yes, we know we're right. When in fact, you know you're right simply if it functions better than previous beliefs. So, rather than try to offer epistemological grounds or foundations for our beliefs, Little p philosophy should instead try to show how our various descriptions, actions, behaviors, institutions, practices hang together in the broadest and loosest sense of the term. It should be a reconstruction of more or less what's our form of life. How does A relate to B? How does our poetry relate to our physics? How does our politics relate to our game playing? How does our economy relate to our sporting events? Whereas philosophy conceives of high cultural inquiry as converging on the truth, that's capital P philosophy. Little p philosophy prefers to see such discourse not as a debate which leads towards the truth, but as a conversation, whose sole purpose is to keep the conversation itself going. There will be no final answers, nor should we even want them. The point is just to keep talking. That's the end in itself. Right? It's carried on for its own sake. In fact, he says that's what we should try to do, is turn Western culture from a debate where we try to get to the bottom and answer questions into nothing more than a conversation which remains open and keeps moving forward. That's what's most valuable in the West. Such a post-philosophic foundational little p philosophy would eschew systematic theory in favor of what we might call, and I have called, edifying discourses. Examples: Hegelian historicism, Nietzschean self-creation, Heidegger's talk of the historically contingent nature of language. All of these, he says, are really not very systematic views at all. They're edifying. They give us a different angle, a different perspective, a different view of things. They offer us wisdom as opposed to, quote, theory. I want to turn finally to his last text, most recent text of, I think, about 2 years ago, called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. In here, this text, Rorty tries to show how his own edifying, pragmatic discourses hang together with the contemporary democratic projects of the West. Projects that Rorty calls, I think quite aptly, postmodern bourgeois liberalism. And I should say, he says it with a smile. He considers himself a good postmodern bourgeois liberal. Rorty doesn't try in this text to ground democracy, or give it philosophic foundations, or prove that it's right or the best form of government. But rather, he offers a view which shows how things cohere with our democratic practices, and offers support short of justification. Now, in fact, there's a good reason why he does this. He makes one of the most refreshing comments in the history of philosophy. He says, look, if we have to get all of society together and tell them, you know, philosophy cannot legitimate democracy, one of them's got to go. Which one's going to go? Right? He says, come on, democracy has priority over philosophy, not the other way around. Philosophy doesn't have to support democracy, just the other way around entirely. If you have a philosophy which is consistent with democracy, you're likely to get adherence. That's the way it really goes. The form of life comes first. Democracy comes first. That's the valuable part of our project. Okay, Rorty in the text argues that post-Hegelian inquiry has shown us contingency. The contingency of our language, right? That it is the way it is, not because of some final fixed metaphysical scheme, but simply because the animals we are made the moves we did at this given time and that given time. Our institutions, similarly, evolved not on the basis of some great plan, but simply through trial and error, right? We did not put in amendments giving us freedom of speech in this country and freedom of religion because we thought they were absolute goods. We wrote such practices because we couldn't enforce orthodoxy. We tried for about 100 years and it failed. There's too many darn sects in this country. Everybody goes off and forms their own little church. So we made a virtue of necessity. Now we see it for different reasons. It was contingent. Similarly, our beliefs, all of our values, all of our institutions, all of our form of life is contingent. Hegel showed us that. What this has allowed us to do is realize how we might redescribe ourselves and our institutions, right? That we can redescribe what the founding fathers were doing. They thought they were making an accommodation with reality, but we can redescribe it as saying, no, they were really leading to the realization that tolerance is good in and of itself, that it's the best form of life. And now we can come to realize, because of this contingency, that there is no big reality, truth, or goodness, no metaphysical virtue which we must subject ourselves to. We create virtue, goodness, truth. They're all contingent. We needn't feel ourselves to be a function of something outside of ourselves, that there is some metaphysical power which we must be subservient to, which once was God and then became science and now is the criterion of meaning or some such thing. We are, as it were, he's being quite humanist. We're the center. There's nothing outside of us upon which we must subject ourselves. Such redescription, then, attempt to look at things from new perspectives, is achieved through something he calls non-normal discourse, which is clearly an allusion to Kuhn. In fact, he specifically cites Kuhn's. So, just as pre-paradigmatic science is non-normal, so redescription is like shifting out of paradigms into looser ways of looking at things. And the best exemplification of this, Rorty believes, is the metaphor. This comes to the question of how one interprets a metaphor. My love is a rose, right? Now, we've heard that metaphor so many times that we can't help thinking that it must either have to do with the fact that my love is sweet and fragrant, or that my love's rather difficult and thorny, right? But the first time you hear a new metaphor, how you interpret it will be completely up to you. It has no fixed meaning. That's non-normal discourse. It breaks free of our paradigms, of our fixed structures of discourse. It's like, in the middle of a conversation, throwing in a new move, a new gesture, stepping back, or coughing when someone says something you disagree with. It's that kind of an idea. You're breaking up the normal flow of things. What happens is, if that turns to be fruitful, if that metaphor strikes you, you'll try it out. And if enough of you find it fruitful, it will eventually become literal, so that it's no longer a metaphor. Consider the metaphor. It's raining cats and dogs. Is it even a metaphor anymore? It's an idiomatic expression. Everyone knows what it means. It literally means it's raining real hard. The first time it was said, it may not have meant that, right? It's become normalized. So it is through this, then, metaphorical redescription, non-normal discourse, that we come to understand the contingency of our own views. Now, the person who does such non-normal discourse, Rorty calls the strong poet. He takes the phrase from the literary critic Harold Bloom. So he'd say, any scientific innovator of a new paradigm is a strong poet. He's good at redescribing things in ways that no one had ever thought of before. Newton, for example, by talking about a thing's gravitas, its gravity, right, was a metaphor. It literally means its seriousness, its profundity. Since then, we've used the metaphor so many times that it's now become exclusively literal. It simply refers to a property which is describable in mathematical terms, an attractional force. So scientific innovators are strong poets. So are utopian reformers, right? A Frederick Douglass who can use the term freedom in such a way to contrast it with chattel slavery and point out the contradictoriness of those two institutions in a way that Americans had never used those terms before, is a strong poet. He's getting us to redescribe ourselves in a different way. A person who can say, look at the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Blacks are men. That's redescription, because clearly they hadn't been men before. They were not part of the same, quote, species as us in a way. That's strong poetry. Strong poet is the hero of Rorty's utopian, postmodern, bourgeois, liberal society. In other words, contingency, irony, and solidarity is his own piece of strong poetry. And he wants to argue that that's the hero of the culture he'd love to see created, and he thinks is being created in America by the young now, in a postmodern bourgeois liberal society in which the strong poet is now our hero. The Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Frederick Douglass, the Einstein perhaps, and not the traditional normal scientist, normal thinker. All right, the second part of the text deals with something he calls ironists. Ironists are people who realize the contingency of what he calls final vocabularies. What is a final vocabulary? He says, imagine you're on your deathbed and you want to describe to someone the meaning of your life, what it was all about. Well, we'll presumably have a certain sum of words in that description which are completely vague and everyone will share. True, good, meaning, they'll all show up somewhere in our final vocabulary. But then, some of us will have different final vocabularies in middle range terms. Some, if we were born, say, 400 years ago in a certain part of Europe, might say England. That would be an important term in the final vocabulary. Magna Carta, the rights of an Englishman. No taxation without representation if it was on this side of the Atlantic, perhaps. Freedom. France. Germany, whatever. Various different terms which show up in our final vocabularies. And they may get even more precise than that. Poetry, science, literature, love, philosophy, depending on who we are. So those are final vocabularies, and everybody has some. The ironist is the person who, first of all, has doubts about their own final vocabulary. It says, my final vocabulary is not authorized by nature or the realm of being or anything like that. In fact, it might be wrong. Also, they realize that their present vocabularies cannot resolve, or what Rorty calls underwrite, these doubts. In other words, they have doubts that maybe they have the wrong final vocabularies, and they're fully aware that those doubts are not resolvable by those vocabularies themselves or by any other vocabulary. And they don't think that their vocabulary corresponds to reality or taps into an extra real metaphysical power, an extra human power which we must subject ourselves to. So those are ironists, right? People who have a final vocabulary but constantly have doubts about it. For such people, their greatest fear, Rorty says, is that they might be a copy, that they might be a replica, that their final vocabularies might not have been their own choosing, might have been imposed by their culture. So they're constantly trying to find new ways of redescribing themselves so that at least they can be, like Nietzsche's, self-creators. Right? Those are ironists. Such irony, then, Rorty urges, would be typical of the democratic intellectual and would be used in practical projects of private self-creation. This is a very important innovation that Rorty has, I think, vis-a-vis Jürgen Habermas, with whom he has a fairly close relationship, philosophically speaking. Yet he says what seems to be the problem with Habermas is he doesn't realize what is wonderful about postmodern bourgeois liberal society is our alienation, is the creation of individuality, that each of us can find richly fulfilling moments apart from others in our own projects of self-creation, and that those projects of self-creation, which are always ironic, right, which are always uncertain, which are always contingent, need not contradict our public projects of ending cruelty and suffering. That those two, irony and solidarity, need not contradict one another. They're separate parts of life. In other words, it is legitimate for us to have a private life apart from the public. Now, liberals for Rorty are people who, as he puts it, think cruelty is the worst thing we can do. And in particular, a form of cruelty with which Rorty is particularly anxious is what he calls humiliation. And he diagnoses humiliation as follows. He says, when you have humiliation, you force someone to do an act or affirm a statement such that they can no longer describe themselves consistently. Right? They can no longer redescribe themselves in such a way that they can live with themselves. That's humiliation. And he says, frankly, that's the ultimate purpose of torture. It's not even the pain, but that humiliation, so that you cannot live with yourself afterwards. So how do we achieve moral education? For Rorty, we achieve it through reading literature, novels, going to movies, seeing plays. Such works sensitize us to the suffering of others and allows us to see their humiliation where previously we hadn't. Right? A text like Ralph Ellson's Invisible Man, in which we see a character who would otherwise be invisible to us. We would not notice him. All of a sudden, we're aware of him and his humiliation at our hands. He says, that's moral education. And he says, this is not a prescriptive claim as to what you should do in terms of reading literature. It's an actual claim. Look at the youth of America today. Where do they get their moral education? Do they read Plato or do they read Toni Morrison? Do they pick up Kant or do they go see JFK by Oliver Stone? And nor should we tell them, shame on you, you should be reading Kant. Shame on you, you should be reading Plato. No, it's not bad if they read that as well. But they are right to get their moral education from those texts. Those texts, for the first time, allow them to see others as something other than others as themselves. Right? It helps us literally redescribe people we thought of as aliens as just like us. Right? Think of a novel, or not a novel, a book like The Diary of Anne Frank. What does it do but tells us, take someone who we thought was an alien, this young Jewish woman, and we read the story and all of a sudden, she's just like we are. She's no longer one of them. She's one of us. So what holds our society together then, for Rorty, is not shared rational legitimations. It's not philosophic beliefs. And this is a good empirical point. How many people even have philosophic beliefs? How many people in our society even read philosophy, much less could care less about it? What holds us together is a sense of solidarity, is a sense of usness, that we're one, that we're a community. It has nothing to do with argumentation or disputation. It has to do with a shared form of life, our democracy, our postmodern bourgeois liberal society. And this is an important philosophical point, because his argument is, if you look at all ethical terms, what they really are what Sellers calls we intentions, right? And the we is our ethnos, or the US/West. And let me try and illustrate that for you for a minute. When you say, use an ethical term like, it's wrong to steal, he says what you're really saying is, there's no absolute to that, but stealing is not the sort of thing we do. Our kinds of people don't steal. So he says, now look, if you really want to deal with a problem of cruelty and suffering, and the one that really troubles Rorty is the plight of young blacks in inner cities. He finds that extremely troubling. He says, you are not going to help them and get any hope for them if you appeal to people's sense of humanity and say, my goodness, humans are suffering there. Humans suffer everywhere. The right way to deal with that problem is to appeal to our ethnocentricity and say, you know, those people are Americans. And we don't do that to our own. We don't allow Americans to live that way. They're not them, they're us. Americans shouldn't tolerate other Americans living such a lifestyle. And his point is, ethical terms as we intentions lose their force as we spread the we out too wide. So if we begin to be concerned about humanity in general, then someone's going to come along and say, yeah, why are you so concerned with humans? What about dogs? What about dolphins? What about whales? And someone else will say, yeah, what about amoebas and planktons? No, the force has power only for our ethnos, the US or the West. Now, he says, such ethnocentricity is not something to be afraid of, in our case, for one reason. Our ethnocentricity of the West is distinguished by its self-correcting fear of ethnocentricity, right? Our ethnocentricity, precisely because it went through a period of vitriolic racism and imperialism, has learned a lesson, that it should distrust itself, and that it should always try to be open as possible. And for once, Rorty is being, not just once, but making a claim which I think is quite accurate, that if you stop and look around the world right now, perhaps because of the horrible things the US and the West have done, it is by far the most tolerant culture in the world. It is the only culture which mistrusts itself, which argues that it should always question its own impulses and urges, and should always make sure that when it looks at another culture, it's not making invidious comparisons. And then what we do is, on a case-by-case basis, we balance our public goals of solidarity and the fight against cruelty with our private projects of self-creation and fulfillment. And I want to pause here and make something clear. He's very careful not to posit any sort of algorithm, right? Any sort of rule for deciding when we do public things and when we do private things. That's a decision that each of us can make. And we'll decide on a case-by-case basis. Or we can make it socially. There's no need to ground it, to fix it, to finalize it. I also want now to stop and pause and take a look at what the implications of this are for the culture in general. A culture in which we no longer feel the need to draw invidious distinctions between various disciplines and fields. We no longer have to distinguish between this is meaningful discourse and this is meaningless discourse, in which we might be perfectly satisfied and happy to say, this discourse sensitizes me and works for me. And if it doesn't do so for you, that's fine too. You have your own private discourse. All we need to agree to is a public discourse, that cruelty is bad, that solidarity is good, and that humiliation is unacceptable. Think of what kind of utopia that would be. A utopia in which your private acts of self-fulfillment, your private acts of perhaps you paint at home, perhaps you write your own little poetry, would never be seen as selfish, as alienating, as distinguishing between you and the rest of the society, in which you could be as much an individual as you choose without losing your sense of the we intention of a society and culture. It's also a sense in which the philosopher takes on a new role. He's no longer the master sitting on high, telling people in the history department, you better tighten up your explanation schemes. And people in the literature department, so much stuff and nonsense, you're deconstructing yourself to death. Rather, the philosopher would be a sort of jack of all trades. Instead of standing above the various disciplines, and the various departments up in a super high ivory tower saying, good in science, bad in math, or whatever, he'd be running between the places, running over to the anthropology department saying, give me something to think about. And as soon as I get that, I'm going to bring it over to the historians and say, have you heard what they're talking about in the anthropology department? How they're thinking about the human project now? While I'm at it, why don't I go over to the literature department and see what they have to say about it? Maybe they'll show me a way of redescribing my own project such that I can bring the anthropologist and the historian together. He says that we're already beginning to see such a field, such a new project. And it's not the philosopher per se, though it is Rorty and it is some other philosophers. He says that figure he wants to call the literary critic. The reason is because, I think quite factually, he represents literary critics don't talk about literature anymore. And not primarily. More often than not, they talk about politics, they talk about philosophy, they talk about coons and science, right? You're just as likely to find a, quote, person hired as a literary critic who knows just as much about, if not more, about the history of science than he actually does about, say, Joseph Conrad's books. And he says that's not something we should fear. It's evolved that way for a good reason. Because philosophy made the mistake of trying to stand above instead of connecting, instead of drawing together. As such a literary critic, I would urge, in fact, that we drop the term literary critic, my own feeling, and replace it with a broader term even than that, the cultural critic, because literary criticism, I think, has certain connotations which cultural criticism doesn't. But the cultural critic then would be a person who's an eclectic, who reads a bit of Kuhn, who reads a bit of Quine, and then maybe goes and looks at a bit of Picasso, listens to a bit of Charles Ives, perhaps. Maybe even a little rap music while he's at it. Maybe even watches a bit of MTV, watches current films, and talks about how it all hangs together, or how it doesn't, when it doesn't. Talks about how this novel has political implications, or this political movement has literary implications, or this scientific movement has historical implications. In fact, I think the beauty of that utopia is that each of you would become cultural critics. That taking a course like this, and other courses, and reading your own books are not only projects of private self-creation and fulfillment, which I think they are, but in fact mean that you're all becoming your own cultural critics. You're all making yourself your own lovers of wisdom, your own philosophers.